like to thank Handel. I was hoping that I'd get a chance to thank Handel personally. We, like some people here, have never met, but have spoken on email and so on. So I do hope he's recovering well, and I will meet him in May, I'm sure. And I'd also like to thank CCIE for inviting me to come to this. This has been an excellent, interesting, fascinating day. What I want to talk about today addresses what is increasingly being referred to as a phenomenon. That is the growing articulation of multiracial and mixed-race identities. The last 10 to 15 years have witnessed an influx in academic and popular inquiry into mixed race, mostly in the United States and UK, but increasingly in Canada. And today it's not difficult to notice the considerable popularity and mainstreaming of mixed race topics and issues in things such as novels, among celebrities, we see them, as well as an increase in hair products designed to multiracial, multi-ethnic people, toys and other items designed to address what is increasingly being seen as a unique experience of being multiracial and identifying with more than one racial and ethnic background. Universities have also begun offering undergraduate courses devoted to more critically understanding multiracial identity. However, more recently, new media, such as mixed-race blogs, websites, and social networking utilities like Facebook and MySpace have rapidly becoming sites in which mainly young multiracial individuals are documenting their experiences about living and growing up mixed. And in fact, mixed-race youth are not only participating in these venues, but they're increasingly becoming their creators. So these forums provide what I think is a really fascinating site in which we can explore emerging new youth identities. And so in this paper, what I want to do is contemplate some examples of these new media, largely multiracial discussions from forums like Facebook and blogs, as emergent and significant sites in which multiracial identities are being articulated. And in particular, I problematize the complex ways in which multiracial youth are experiencing their racialized worlds, negotiating belonging and articulating their identities. What I see as useful in this exploration is its potential to foster a more developed understanding of evolving conceptualizations of sameness and difference in the context of racial and ethnic identities. And what I suggest is that what many multiracial youth seem to be unpacking on these sites offer useful accounts of what might actually be seen as unlivable for some youth in their everyday lives, and while also illustrating their varied attempts to make possible or livable their different multiracial identities. So before I address some of the sites in which many mixed-race youths participate and what this might contribute to our discussion of multiracial youth and new youth identities, I want to take a moment and just contextualize the current research around multiracial youth for those who may be unfamiliar. It's only been within the past 15 to 20 years that we've really seen serious research into issues of mixed race. You know, maybe the last 20 years, largely around the late 80s. And a growing number of books and publications documenting multiracial identity formation, largely in the US and UK, but more recently in Canada, present a variety of themes and findings regarding multiracial people. For example, while much of this research has been conducted by racially mixed people themselves who identify as such, recent work in the area of critical mixed race theory has highlighted the significance of exploring the experiences of those who identify, acknowledge, and seek support for their multiple racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds. And there's now quite a bit of literature in the area documenting how mixed race identities, by processes of, influenced by processes of racialization, shift and change across time and in different racialized spaces. The growing critical literature on multiracial or biracial or mixed race experiences challenges the assumption that multiracial people are more susceptible to suffering and identity confusion than those who are deemed so-called racially pure or monoracial is the terminology that's being used. Further, they're also challenging the rigidity and the paradoxes of racial classification altogether. So by highlighting the wide-ranging diversity in multiracial experiences, which vary across family, across nation, class, culture, ethnicity, and so on, this literature marks a shift from the more common identity frameworks that have explored multiracial identity through linear identity development models, which assume that a fully integrated biracial or multiracial identity is the desired end state. Instead, research is beginning to position racism and so on, conceived more broadly and complexly, as the main culprit shaping a lot of multiracial experiences, rather than, of course, family dysfunction, psychopathology, and identity confusion. So this work coincides with shifts in youth research that is shifting its focus away from discourses of youth as a problem and moving towards exploring the significance of pragmatic choices and what Handel in his work describes as new youth subjectivities as key elements affecting social change in the lives of young people. So by understanding this process of negotiation, we're better able to witness actions multiracial individuals might take in response to their racialized contexts. So what allows us to refer to multiracial identities as new, and I want to be clear on my speaking about it as new, is not because there are growing numbers of people who are identifying as mixed race, nationally or globally, or simply because more people are claiming mixed race identities, but I see racial mixture as being new because of how it's been being taken up. Mixed race is itself not new. I mean, at least it has a long, sordid history. And but what's new are the ways that mixed race identities have become matters of public interest, and as well as the shifting forms of expression that they take. So mixed race people, so defined, as critical race theorist Paul Spicker puts it, are owning up to their mixedness. They're talking about their mixed selves. And it is this increasing demand for recognition of one's racial mixture as a unique category and point of identity that signals a crossroad in the discourse of race, racism, and racial identity. So it's here that I turn to the growth in new media as one of the spaces in which mixture is being framed. I contemplate the ways in which mixed race youth position themselves in these spaces, not in terms of deficit, but rather in ways that create defined spaces of belonging on the one hand, and which are also simultaneously potentially resistant and fluid on the other. So by looking at these spaces, I'm interested, at least in what I'm talking about today, in what an interrogation of various identities found there might make possible or speakable for youth themselves and also for those engaged in youth research on racialized youth. So what are the new media that multiracial youth are participating in, and how might we read that participation? A diverse collection of multiracial forums can be found on various sites and blog spots, and some of you may be familiar with them. The more popular sites carry names like Eurasian Nation, Maven Foundation, M-A-V-I-N. I apologize for not having these up here. I realize the irony of talking about new media and not using new media to discuss this. But HAPA issue forums, Mixed Media Watch is another one, and the Multiracial Activist, and so on. There's a whole slew of different sites designated specifically to multiracial experiences of all different kinds. And Facebook is an especially fascinating site. And as many of you, I'm sure, know, any member who joins Facebook, which is a social utility site where you can put your profile and you can post all sorts of information about yourself and interact with those who are also members. You can also create groups, and these groups are social interest groups, political groups, and anybody who's a member can create a discussion group with various sub-discussions along with it. And on the subject of multiraciality, dozens of Facebook groups, each offering several subgroup discussions, have multiplied exponentially in just the last 12 months alone. And these groups hold names such as Mixed and Loving It, or I'm Mixed and Proud, or another one would be Halfies and Mixed Kids Gone Global. among numerous others, and you see the trend, a lot of them are naming their groups this way. And some report membership in the thousands, and more are added almost daily. And most of these sites are organized and used by multiracial individuals who often report that they are interested in connecting with other multiracial people. So overall, these multiracial online communities, like many online communities, are valued for their ability to provide an immediate and accessible connection. Ironically, this feeling of connection can also be sustained while remaining anonymous, as one needs to include as much information as one is comfortable with. Nevertheless, the sheer volume and growth of participation in these groups says something significant about how and where a sense of multiracial belonging and community might be seen as absent in other people's lives, in other aspects of people's lives. So for today, I want to unpack two broad themes that emerge or seem to emerge in these new media, and which I see as necessary conceptualizations within future mixed-race research. The first is the creation and utility of these sites as what I'm referring to as livable spaces, and the second addresses the potential for these sites to foster paradoxical or resistant identities. So most commonly expressed in multiracial narratives of growing up is an awareness of the racialized contradictions and negotiated belonging inherent in their experiences at home, in school, among peers. For example, regularly found in discussion streams on Facebook and other blogs include experiences of having to deal with frequent questions and interrogations into one's racial background of, such as, what are you, who are you from? Others explore feelings of having to prove their membership in different communities while ultimately feeling excluded from all. This burden of proof exists not only with strangers, but also with extended family and peers. And yet others describe how their ambiguous appearance allows them to move easily through different racialized landscapes while affording them the opportunity to choose multiple racial designations without fear of interrogation. Now, these experiences are not unknown within multiracial research and comprise common expressions within what has been called a multiracial experience. These sorts of experiences are identified in new media spaces again and again, and this is what I describe as unlivable. It is these frustrating, annoying, excluding, and at times infuriating, as they're described, racialized experiences that are felt that I see as being felt as unlivable. And I draw the term unlivable from Ronaldo Walcott, who suggests that by accounting for the instability of identities in a variety of contexts, we're offered a way of seeing how life, and I quote, how life is not only lived out in mutuality, as contemporary multiculturalism suggests is possible, but also points to the aggressive ways in which life is lived and made unlivable for some, end quote. So doing so allows for new possibilities of rethinking restrictive binaries such as white, black, dominant, marginalized, and so on. In terms of these forums, we might then conceptualize them as livable spaces in which some multiracial youth can exist on their own terms and interrogate their identities without being interrogated or forced to choose or prove who they are expected to be. It's in these spaces that one can be understood and in many ways are a safe space. Or perceived and gone to as a safe space. It's also a place where they can work out their identities and processes of becoming while engaging with the stories of others who are also coming to terms with their own feelings and of vulnerability. In one popular Facebook group called Havies and Mixed Kids Gone Global, many comments expressed sentiments such as this: I just joined this group and I'm relieved to find people finally understand what I'm going through. And overall, comments made in discussion groups are quite encouraging, they're familiar, they're supportive. Other comments speak to this as well, stating how they are excited about a space where I can just be who I am without having to explain it over and over again. Some even offer friendly tips on how to deal with issues such as racism in one's extended family, or offer suggestions on how to subvert that "who are you, what are you" question that is so common in that experience. So others use the forum to explore whether or not there are other people out there who might share a similar experience. For example, one individual commented on how, and said, "I'm looking to find others out there who are Portuguese, Filipino, Asian mix," as one person talked about. So, and that's common. However, I read these forums as doing much more than just informing us of supportive sites that where youth can assert their individualized identities without reproach. They also represent what Sarah Ahmed might describe as a story of a we, in which the act of remembering through engagement with others enables multiracial individuals to reclaim and reassert feelings of loss, exclusion, as well as family and community ties, but all in a context where others have got your back. So, but as feminist pedagogues, of course, always remind us, like Elizabeth Ellsworth, for example, safe group spaces are complex, not easily created, nor always possible. In many discussion groups, what's interesting is some members were verbally attacked. And of course, as I mentioned, anybody can join these groups as long as you're a member in the Facebook sense, for example. These attacks were often personalized and aggressive, but could also be directed at the entire forum. For example, one comment challenged one young woman's choice to describe her background. The woman in this case used about 7 or 8 descriptors of racial and ethnic heritages that she associated with her background to describe who she was. And the comment was, "You're black, get over it. Why do you have to make things so complicated for yourself and everyone else?" And other comments include, "I don't know why this is an issue for you, you need to get a life," and so on. So, so while this experience is suggestive of many multiracial experiences, it's what followed these attacks that's most illustrative of the influence of these spaces. So these naysayers, if we can call them that, were often almost immediately schooled in subsequent postings by members who rigorously defended the group and its majority members. By schooled, I mean that they were vigorously reminded that this was a supportive space, that people have every right to identify in whatever way they choose, and that comments suggesting otherwise were only, as one person put it, conforming to oppressive ideology and should, as another person said, rethink their position and get with the program. So this made it exceptionally clear that the purpose of this group was to provide a safe space, and revealed that while these may be open spaces, they are still highly protected ones. And the defensive posturing raises important questions as we consider the development and maintenance of new identities in the context of both old and emerging sites of inclusion and exclusion. As critical theories of race and racism remind us, racial discourses structure and determine accepted and acceptable types of racialized experience that govern community belonging. With this interpretation in mind, it becomes clear how dissent from what is often understood to be understood as a multiracial discursive perspective can be heavily policed. As G explains, discourses can also be understood as clubs, where there are, and I quote, rules about who is a member and who is not, and tacit rules about how members ought to behave if they wish to continue being accepted as members, end quote. Membership thus depends on replicating particular accepted and insider ways of thinking, of acting, and so on, which serve as tests for how one is determined to be part of a group. So worth questioning with respect to these new spaces in which youth and others may be creating or participating are forms and ways of exclusion and inclusion, insider and outsider, which are often maintained and constituted. We have yet to fully unravel the variety of complex ways that racialization gets socially constructed in such undefined spaces, but it's clear clear that as easily as spaces like Facebook, for example, Facebook groups, can offer support and resist restricting racial categories by enabling the construction of new identities, it can also just as easily become a site of limitation and policing. So not only do these forums draw attention to some of the impact of youth group traditional conceptualizations of race and racism, and this is the second theme that I want to address. In a sense, spaces such as these make possible the articulation of resistant identities. But by resistant, I mean that they offer a counter-imaginary to racial binaries and categorization. For example, Naomi Zak, one of the pioneers of this field called critical mixed race theory, critical mixed race discourse, speaks of the capacity and need for many multiracial individuals to write themselves into existence. Her claim is written in recognition that racialized discourses continually understand racial mixture as threatening to dominant hegemonic practices, and thus tend to situate mixture as invalid, as invisible, or pathologize or over-celebrate multiracial experiences and locations. So personal articulations of mixed race identities then allow for the recognition and visibility of a range of new positions and identities previously unspoken or unacknowledged. So we see some of this most obviously in effect through much of the wordplay on these sites, or what Walcott might refer to in a different context as grammars. Many of these youth play with form, with content, word usage, as they write about themselves or write themselves into existence. In this sense, creative labels such as Latino, beige, Blasian, as well as Happy, and then other more commonly used ones like Eurasian and Hapa and so on are constantly used, and others are created all the time as personalized expressions and personalized descriptors. Some groups themselves apply these words in their titles or add labels with connotations of resistance, such as multiracial revolution or mixed race youth right revolution, or some of the names of some of the subgroups. By daring inviting others to modify their definitions and conceptualizations of racial mixture, these forums have the potential to allow youth and others to simultaneously unpack, question, and rethink static definitions of race, nation, and culture through their complex racialized experiences of difference and their articulations of identity. Further, by positioning themselves on virtual paper, you could call it, as shifting and in flux, and also at times ambivalent, they potentially challenge static and binary notions of identity and subjectivity that serve to remind us that the pinpointing of a common racial and multiracial subject is impossible. However, I do approach the subversive potential of such identities with some caution. While the assertion of ambivalence of identities remains hopeful, optimism among some cultural and hybridity theorists, we can speak about Homi Bhabha and his notion of third space, for example. Others are more cautious. I return to Sarah Ahmed here, who warns that we should be more skeptical about romanticizing ambivalent and ambiguous hybrid identities. She argues that disrupting social norms is not always a subversive process. This is especially visible in postmodern commodity cultures that privilege fragmentation, fluidity, difference, and marketing, and so on. And as Ahmed argues, relations of power that can actually be maintained through processes of destabilization. So on this point, she asks, quote, how do ambiguous bodies get read in a way which further supports the enunciative power of those who are telling the difference? Hybridity, as she so aptly explains, does not belong to the mixed race subject. Quote. So I situate these forums as discursive practices which provide what Paul Spickard has described as intimate portraits of larger racializing processes. And as intimate portraits, they provide us sites for locating, reading, and interpreting, and differently understanding multiracial identifications and the invention of self. And as Suki Ali explains in her research on mixed race youth in the UK, explorations of mixed race open up space to investigate the tenacity of raciality and make connections between cultural theory and lived experience. In this respect, I'd like to offer some final thoughts. I'm okay for time? just some final thoughts on what these spaces might suggest for how we contemplate ideologies such as multiculturalism. This is one thing that emerged. After all, multiculturalism provides the lens through which many of us in this country come to engage with cultural diversity, as well as understand, experience, and articulate our racial and ethnic identities. So notable in these new media discussions are also pushbacks against multiculturalism, particularly in terms of the restrictions it imposes on fluid and unsegmented identities. So a host of critical theorists have made clear that multiculturalism's focus on ethnicity issues many race-based identities, which are shaped by various forms of structural and everyday racism. Further, as Manel Matani here in Canada explains, the ideology of multiculturalism creates what she calls a burden of hyphenation, where one is seen as not solely Canadian, but Canadian and fill in your ethnic background. So in order for multiracial people, for example, to become visible in this context, is her critique, that they're expected to take on identities that make sense within society's dominant cultural logic, namely monoracial identities that are strung together by hyphens, such as Jamaican Canadian or Chinese Pakistani Canadian, and so on. So in Canada, our tendency to use cultural hyphens to identify who is Canadian, who is not Canadian, overlooks the complexity of mixed race identities, at least the ways that they're being articulated increasingly among this new emergent mixed race population, which are often situated outside or between racial and ethnic categories. So it's with this recognition that some postings provide critiques of multiculturalism. And this is what one person in Canada had to say before describing his racial background. And I quote, it's a little bit of paragraph. "I'm going to identify according to my different races, not cultures, because how people see me racially is what I feel is my experience. I've noticed that not many people do that, and not many people in my school in Toronto do it either. Everyone seems to be stuck on that weird multicultural idea that we have to either choose one cultural background or else link all our different cultures together with hyphens. Some of my friends think I'm crazy. It's so weird. I hate that. But I don't know much about my parents' cultures. I'm Black, Asian, white, mixed race person, period." Okay, so we're done.
Thank you.